Hi, and welcome to churchtherapy.com's pastor training videos. I'm Kristen Kinsevich, licensed mental health counselor on staff at East Coast International Church in Lynn, Massachusetts. Today we're going to be talking about how to decrease stigma around mental illness in your congregation. Now, I want to make a couple things clear before we get started. Number one, when we think of the words mental illness, because of the stigma that has typically been there, and this dates back through our history as a country, looking at the last 150 years, we tend to view mental illness in kind of crazy movie frameworks with psychiatric hospitals and people acting psychotic, really, which certainly can be a component of untreated mental illness. But we're also including things like depression and anxiety that are occurring on a clinical level that are disruptive to people's lives, that are of an intense nature that's beyond what would be a normal worry of any given day. And so we're really, number one, starting to expand our definition of what is mental illness. It's something going wrong in the brain. And while we are still developing tests to measure that kind of thing, right now we're still in the very infancy stages, in my opinion, of neuroscience. There is more and more research coming out, tests that are being developed that can help us identify specific things that are going wrong in the brain. And that's just, good news for treatment, because the more precise we can get in measuring what's going on in the brain, the more precise the treatments can be. So that's the first part, is just number one, recognizing that we have some stereotypes when we hear mental illness, and that's the stigma that we want to start decreasing. That in any given year, 1 out of 4 adults is going to experience symptoms of a clinical mental illness. And so in your congregation, what would that look like? Hopefully we're attracting broken people into our churches, and so it might actually be a little bit higher percentage of people that are hurting and looking for some answers and looking for some hope. The second thing I want to point out is that reducing stigma does not mean that we just accept symptoms and say, okay, you can just be that way. If someone has bipolar disorder, certainly we would not say, okay, well, let's reduce stigma and just accept that person and do nothing for their symptoms. Treatment is available, accessible, and that's part of reducing stigma, is really helping people access services when they need them through medication, counseling, or support groups. So we really want to think about these things as treatable, and while I certainly hope that there are more advanced treatments coming down the line in the next 20, 50, 100 years for sure, right now we need to just encourage people to get help. So with that said, I think the first thing that you as a pastor can do to begin to reduce stigma in your congregation is to just start reading and educating yourself about mental illness. There's a few books that can help you do that, written from a Christian perspective, so that you can kind of understand the dialogue of Christian faith and this wrestling with why is mental illness such a hard one for us to understand. Certainly if someone has cancer, the first instinct is not to say, okay, well, let's just exclusively pray for this person and not have them go to the doctor. Certainly we would encourage them to go to the doctor, and we would pray for them. Mental illness is much the same way. Sometimes it's been confused with some type of demonic influence, for example. And really that's, I think, just speaks to the lack of understanding around what's going on in the brain. What we can't explain, what we can't measure, we just tend to spiritualize. And I don't think that it's not spiritual any more than cancer is not spiritual. There are spiritual implications to the fact that we live in a cursed world where disease and disorder abound. However, it doesn't mean that we need to exorcise that person or somehow tell them to trust God or have more faith, because that's not going to alleviate their symptoms. They should do that and get treatment. So we're really looking at both. So a couple books that I can recommend. One is Grace for the Afflicted. That's by Dr. Matthew Stanford. He's a former Baylor professor of neuroscience. Really great book. Highly recommend that. Another one is called Troubled Minds, and this is by Amy Simpson, put out by InterVarsity Press. And this is another great one. She tells her story of her mother's battle with schizophrenia and just her own processing of that. She gives some really great information, and she has some really great tips in there for how churches can begin to reach out to those with mental illness. And finally, my book is available on Amazon. It's called On Edge: Mental Illness in the Christian Context. This goes through specific disorders and types of problems you might find, as well as things like, should a Christian take psychiatric medications? So if you have some questions like that, it's a question kind of based book, and I try to respond to some common questions that I've actually been asked as my time as a Christian counselor in the last decade. So hope those resources can be a starting point for you. The second piece of education is really to understand what is available in your community. Certainly looking up the National Alliance for Mental Illness, NAMI. There's chapters in various locations, and so you can connect with them either online or in your direct geographic area. Things like mental health agencies, what's available. Of course, if there are Christian counselors in your area, hopefully you'll already know a little bit about who they are, and maybe you're referring to them now. So those are some ways to just resource yourself. Who would you call? Is there an emergency psychiatric number, for example, that you could call? Those kinds of things are helpful to know in advance. And then I think another thing you can do is really start talking about mental illness from the pulpit, within small groups, just making it a commonplace conversation within your congregation. So just number one, validating the reality of the struggle that people sometimes have, encouraging people to get help when they need it. When you say those kinds of things from the pulpit, it kind of gives a little bit more authority to that. And I think, as we talk about Jesus being a healer, and as we talk about wholeness and restoration, any kind of illness, cancer, diabetes, chronic mental illness, any of these things, we have the hope of Christ that we aren't going to remain this way forever. We have the hope of treatment and ways that we are able to access resources here in America. And so talking about mental illness as just one of the things that people are struggling with, you can list it in a list just like that: cancer, diabetes, mental illness, and that brings it into light a little bit, that it equates it with something's going wrong in your body. And that's really an important message for people to hear, when a lot of the message of the church has been, you're doing something wrong, your faith is wrong. If you trusted God more, you still wouldn't have this problem. So changing that message is really important. And then I think also bringing in some ministries that can help you make that part of the language and the culture at your church. A lot of times people are now recommending peer support groups. So this can be a kind of peer-led mental illness kind of support group. They can meet weekly. There are some curriculums out there. The Mental Health Grace Alliance has put out a curriculum called Thrive, which you could take a look at. So there's some different ways that you can, just like they have Celebrate Recovery as an addiction option for, they have a curriculum and they have things you can go through. There are a few mental illness focused ones as well now. So that would be something to take a look at. And then finally, I think considering hiring a professional Christian counselor to come onto your church staff. I've been talking about this a lot on churchtherapy.com. If you go there and you look at the residency program tab, you'll see a very new concept that I'm trying to start, looking for pastors who are interested and willing to hire a professional counselor on their staff for half of the normal salary rate. There's other kinds of revenue streams that counseling can generate. And so I am happy to talk with you. If you're a pastor that's interested in that, please email me at newhope@ecic.tv. Would love to hear from you. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.